without any further ado, my friends, I'm going to jump right into the topic because this month we've been talking about relationships, love, relationships. It's February. We're already at February 19th. We're almost done with February. It's going way too fast for me. But the point of relationships and love has a lot to do with how we establish our relationships, how we set healthy boundaries. And I want to talk about not only personal, your love, romantic relationship, but certainly about all of your relationships. So the reasons I'm focusing on that is because toxicity leaves clues. And what do I mean by that? So simply put, toxicity leaves clues means that patterns of toxicity in one relationship will also manifest in your other relationships. So take a moment here to think about this right now and see and explore if you might have noticed behavioral patterns either from yourself, sometimes they're unconscious, but either from yourself or others that appear across different relationships. Have you noticed toxic behavioral patterns from yourself or others that seem to cross boundaries, right? That melt into other relationships? Because these can be unintentional, right? But just to really be honest and to take an internal view, think about if you or someone you know who is not respecting your own boundaries, are some of the behavioral patterns linked to manipulation. And manipulation can be a very undercover way of presenting as a toxic behavior. Disrespect is usually easier to identify whether we are being disrespectful at times or if people in our lives are being disrespectful toward us. And ultimately, all of these are emotional abuse, right? Verbal emotional abuse about sometimes belittling a person, saying words that might be rude or disrespectful. So I want us to turn the lens on ourselves in a kind, mindful manner, to be honest about our own toxic behaviors, should we have any. And then also look at others in your circle, your close circle. Are there any people in your close circle that you might need to breathe out because there is a toxic relationship and you're having a hard time establishing healthy boundaries? So toxic tendencies will often exhibit similar patterns of behavior regardless who they're interacting with. So that's what I mean about crossing boundaries. If we have them somewhere, we are probably having them elsewhere. And so another form of toxicity, the idea that toxicity leaves clues, is oftentimes about underlying issues. What do I mean by underlying issues? Well, those can look like unresolved trauma, insecurity, low self-esteem, insecurity, or also a lack of emotional intelligence. And I want you to put on your open-ended ears today so that everything that I'm sharing with you is not a personal affront. It's not a personal attack on how you might be. And it could also be how we are, right? In some areas of my life, I lack emotional intelligence. So the first step about recognizing toxicity, and for ourselves, recognizing how toxicity leaves clues, is to be honest about our own behavior. So this is why I want us to explore it from an open-ended view, right? Open-ended ears and eyes and thoughts, because I strongly believe that in all of our relationships in our lives, the first person that we need to look at is ourselves. Certainly, I believe that I need to look at myself first and foremost in my relationships and see if I'm the one inviting toxic behavior in the relationship. So, the reason I want to talk about cross border, right? So you're going beyond, it's not one toxic behavior is not just in one relationship, but in several others, is because they actually permeate various aspects of our lives. They show up insidiously, little ways. So if we're not mindful of our own behavior and then taking note of how we might be inviting toxicity in our environment, it's going to be very difficult to identify another's toxic behavior, and therefore makes it very difficult to create healthy boundaries. So, boundary violations is clearly a big part of how toxicity leaves clues. Have you ever noticed how some people will disregard boundaries, disrespect the autonomy of others? And it may not be with you. You might have just observed that in social environments. Whether it's invading personal space, disregarding consent, or manipulating emotions, boundary violations are clearly indicative of deeper issues. Another aspect of how toxicity leaves clues is the cycle of dysfunction. So to pay attention here to the cycles of dysfunctions, whether they're your own or you're observing them in others. And I'll give you an example. So someone who experiences emotional abuse in one relationship may very well inadvertently seek out or tolerate similar dynamics in subsequent relationships because it's familiar. It's a familiar way of being, and sometimes it's hard to identify the cycle of dysfunction because that's what we're used to, right? So we want to look at those, like I mentioned, the first one is the boundary violations. Are people violating your boundaries? Are you violating other people's boundaries? And sometimes it's very subtle. For some parents, it's violating boundaries with their children because they feel as a parent that they have the right answer, or in a way they want to help. You may want to help your children, but you might be inadvertently violating their boundary. It's a pretty big topic, right? And we have to be kind to ourselves as we allow for these thoughts to arise, should there be some truth in that. So I really want to invite you into exploring yourself. Do you violate other people's boundaries? If you can be honest and identify that, it will make it easier for you to identify if others are violating your boundaries. The second one I mentioned right now is the cycle of dysfunction. When we're so used to a behavioral pattern of not establishing boundaries, we actually seek for it in other relationships. And this is subconscious. We develop these patterns ourselves where we're actually seeking that in other relationships. And the other point where it supports the toxicity leaves clues perspective is your impact on perception and interactions. So toxic relationships distorts one's perception of what is normal or acceptable behavior. And this distorted perception will influence how one interacts with others. And of course, this leads us to unknowingly, unconsciously perpetuating toxic dynamics and or attract similar dynamics of behaviors from others. So when I wrote last week in my newsletter about knowing thyself, I talked about 3 important points last week in my newsletter. The first was knowing thyself. This is not just a philosophical adage, right? It's deeper than that. It's a practical necessity, especially when it comes to setting boundaries. So, if this is making sense to you, please let me know in the comments if you're relating to what I'm saying, if this is helpful and if this makes sense to you, because we're going to move into now the knowing thyself piece. What do I mean by that? What does it mean to know thyself? Well, understanding your own needs, values, and limits is crucial for several reasons. The first one is authenticity. So when you know yourself, you're better equipped to authentically express your thoughts, your feelings, and your desires. So when we're being authentic, we foster genuine connections with others because we're not hiding behind a facade or conforming to someone else's expectations. So this approach to becoming more authentic, and it's a big buzzword, right? We use that a lot. Lots of people use that in social media right now, how to become your authentic self. And in the way that I'm inviting you to consider it here is really in relationship to setting your healthy boundaries. As you become more authentic, and I would say more grounded, more centered with yourself. And this is a lifelong experience, right? This is a lifelong discovery. Who are we really? And to explore becoming more and more of who you truly are. And I feel that this is done a lot of the time when we have a creative outlet. If we are vocalists or painters or writers or taking walks in nature or meditation or practicing mindful communication, all of these creative outlets allow us to drop more deeply into our authentic self. So we're not wearing facades, meaning you're not that different from when you're home as opposed to when you're going out in a social environment. Overall, you're pretty much the same person. And, that's a skill to develop because a lot of people have social anxiety. So a lot of the time, if we go out and socialize, we change who we are to adapt to the environment, mostly because we're uncomfortable. So this practicing of developing authenticity with the self, our center, our midline, to really show up as we are, is super important in developing better relationships and ultimately in setting healthier and more specific boundaries in our lives. Another piece that really helps with knowing thyself is clarity. As we become more authentic, more comfortable with who we are, we develop better clarity about our needs, our values, and these provide a solid foundation for setting boundaries. Because without clarity, it's really easy to get swept up in other people's agendas or to compromise on things that are important to you. So knowing yourself allows you to confidently articulate what you will and will not accept in your relationships. The next point to know thyself better is to develop a deeper sense of personal respect for yourself. Setting boundaries is an act of self-respect, and it's also a way of respecting others. When you know your limits, and you communicate them clearly, you are enabling others to understand how to interact with you in a way that's mutually beneficial. So I always say, we actually trained people in how to be with us based on how we show up in the relationship. So if you allow for your partner or your child or your friend or your sibling to speak with you from a space of disrespect, that's how we are training them to speak to us. We are actually allowing for this energy, for this dynamic to be shared. As you develop more authenticity, a deeper connection with yourself, and you become clearer about who you are, your needs, your values, your desires, then you start to carve out more honest, clearer boundaries with those around you. So you're training people how to deal with you, how to be with you, how to speak with you. And we change in life. If you're doing these classes with me, this is all based on mind-body alignment, but clearly personal development, spiritual development. So this is ongoing in our lives. So as you start to change and deepen your relationship with your body, mind, with your heart, with your spiritual practice, you automatically become more authentic. And as you change, now you have to also train people how to deal with you differently because you're changing. So this requires for you to express yourself from a place of present awareness, from a place of clarity. Knowing thyself also includes practicing self-care. So this is all about the self-care I'm talking about here is understanding your limits. Because when you understand your limits, you prevent burnout and you prevent resentment. And this, my friends, is so important because if you cultivate resentment, if you are not clear with your relationships and with your voice in expressing your boundaries, what happens is that resentment also leaves clues. Toxicity leaves clues in your body. You may start to develop physical pain in your body. Your back might go out and you're thinking, I didn't do anything different. Stress, resentment, toxicity will all have an impact on your body. These are not separate. So when you're aware of what drains your energy, or when you're aware of what causes you stress, you can clearly take proactive steps to protect your well-being. And that means very clearly saying no to certain commitments, saying no to certain commitments and prioritizing yourself, and also seeking support when you need it. So support might look like being here with me today, just as reminders, right, as to how to set those healthier boundaries. We have busy lives, and relationships are interesting because they melt into one another, right? And they're going well until they don't. And then you take a pause and you look at your relationship, or your friend or spouse or child says something to you and you go like, whoa, what's happening? Like, we're not communicating. This was disrespectful, or I am finding myself resentful toward you. Well, there's a reason for that. And that's very normal in life. To give yourself some grace around how things evolve in your life, because we keep moving with life and it's going pretty well up until it doesn't. And when it doesn't, it's time for a check-in. It's time to reset your boundaries, because to be perfectly honest, when we find ourselves violated, when other people move into our energetic sphere, a lot of the time it has to do with us not being clear on our own boundaries. And so that's okay. That's life, right? We move and then we reset. So knowing yourself better is going to increase your level of not just respect for yourself, but respect for others. And finally, when you know thyself, right, when you practice all of these that I shared with you, you start to feel empowered. Empowerment. And empowerment invites you to take ownership of your life and your choices. So instead of passively reacting to situations, when you're empowered, you actually become an active participant in shaping your own reality. And this sense of empowerment is truly essential for cultivating those healthy boundaries and building fulfilling relationships. Because once you focus on establishing those healthy boundaries, Naturally, what's going to happen is that some people might fall out of your life. And that gives space for others, more fulfilling relationships to enter. And we want to deal with this from a place of mindful awareness, because we're not throwing anybody under the bus. However, as you change, as you evolve, as you grow your own emotional intelligence, as you become clear about who you are, your needs, your desires at this time of your life, you will start to notice that by setting those healthier boundaries, you may lose a few people along the way. This is where the emotional intelligence component comes in, because you have to be ready to lose those relationships. Because if you're not, then you may be the one who's clinging. So to go back to that honesty, why are you in the relationships that you're in if they are toxic? These are really great reflections to have with oneself. So now that you've put some focus in learning to know yourself, your values, your limits with more intention, let's move into clarifying your communication style when it comes to expressing your boundaries. And this piece can be a little bit tricky, because some people can be overtly disrespectful, right? And a lot of the time, people are unconscious of their toxic behavior. And that could be happening to us as well. So now, how do we communicate clearly? How do we express our boundaries? So I wanted to give you a few tips that might be helpful. When expressing your boundaries, I encourage you to use I statements to assert your feelings and needs without placing blame on the other person. So it looks like this. Instead of saying, "You always invade my personal space." Notice how the accent is on you. The other person is the problem. And in the work that we do together, we always look to ourselves first, right? So instead of saying "you are always invading my personal space," change it to an I statement that would sound like, "I feel uncomfortable when my personal space is invaded." I feel uncomfortable when my personal space is invaded. Notice I never use the word you. This approach focuses on your own experiences and emotions, making it less confrontational and more likely to be received positively. Using I statements. Another way to express your boundaries, to communicate them clearly, is to be direct and clear. Clearly articulating your boundaries in a direct and unambiguous manner. Develop clear language. Avoid beating around the bush or using vague language that could be misinterpreted. State your boundaries firmly and assertively, leaving no room for confusion or misinterpretation. For example, instead of saying, "I guess it would be nice if you could give me some space sometimes." See how ambiguous that is. "I guess it would be nice if you could give me some space sometimes." Instead, use, "I need you to respect my personal space. I need you to respect my personal space. I would like to ask you to respect my personal space. Please refrain from entering my room without knocking." Or you can also say, "Please stop texting me. It's too much." Very clear, unambiguous, and it can sound a little bit harsh initially. However, using a tone that is clear and gentle will make all the difference. So instead of saying, "I guess it would be nice if you could give me some space sometimes," I would say something like, "Listen, I really value my personal space, and I'd like to ask you if you could please not text me as frequently as you do." You see the difference. So I'm being kind, I'm smiling, and I'm making a direct request. These are skills to be developed in communication skills, because your body, your eyes, your facial muscles, how you respond to this, how you invite people into exploring boundaries is super important. It's not just the words that you speak. It's how you show up in your body. Clearly, mind, body, mind alignment, an embodied sense of communication, because you're working from your entire body. And finally, after you have used I statements, you're clear and direct. Here's the most important one, is that you enforce consequences when people don't respect your boundaries. So clearly communicating the consequences of continued boundary violations is what will actually make it stick. You want to let the person know what will happen if they persist in disrespecting your space. And this is really important here. You want to follow through with this, because if you don't, then you're not being serious about your boundaries. This is a hard piece to do for many of us. So you communicate it clearly, right? You enforce the consequences. So if you continue, you could say something like, listen, if you insist on disregarding my space, if you insist on not honoring my request, I'm going to need to limit our interactions until I feel comfortable again. I'm going to repeat that. If you choose to continue to disregard my space, or if you choose to avoid my request in being more respectful of boundaries, I'm going to need to limit our interactions until I feel comfortable or safe enough to do so. This type of approach will establish boundaries and encourages the other person to respect them. I hope this is making sense. A lot of it is in the mindful communication, that you're being specific and precise with your language. So again, once you know who you are, you're standing in your center, right? You are expressing yourself authentically. You're clear, you're respectful, you know how to take care of yourself, your self-care, feeling empowered about the position you're taking. Then you want to communicate clearly by using I statements. Again, be direct, kind and direct. Less words is better. Be clear, to the point. And finally, enforcing the consequences. You want to enforce consequences if people continue to disrespect those boundaries. So as you enforce these boundaries, you want to set and implement limits. So now that you've clearly communicated your boundaries, it's really essential to set and implement limits around how you engage with the person who is imposing themselves. And this might involve setting specific timeframes for responding to messages. It might look like restricting access to your social media accounts, or even blocking some people if it comes to this, if it's necessary. Be consistent in practicing enforcing your limits, because you want to become more connected. You want to become clear around how to enforce boundaries. So for example, you might decide to check your messages at a certain time of day and refrain from responding immediately when someone messages you, right? You don't have to respond to people right away. Just be serious about creating your boundaries. And, if you're not implementing using privacy settings and blocking some people, we want to explore that. You want to look within yourself. What is it that makes you uncomfortable about blocking people? It can seem like a harsh approach. However, if people continue to overstep their boundaries, it leaves you no choice as you become clearer and clearer as to how to respond to them. Because protecting your mental and your emotional well-being should always be your priority. Sometimes people are triggered by something, or sometimes people are in admiration with you, or they become slightly obsessive. And I'm finding this to be more frequent in my conversations with friends, and even as a practitioner in my own business. There seems to be more of an obsessive component to following people, to responding to them. This whole social media platform, if we're not careful, we get sucked into it. And, there's a very unsafe space with social media where people express themselves harshly, or when they're triggered, they'll say something unkind, even if the post makes no difference. There's a big ongoing kind of trendy way of being on social media. That's so cool, right? That you're supposed to be part of the conversation, and so you kind of minimize another, or you contrast them, or you're in opposed vision of what another person says, and that's fair. It's just that, how much of your time do you really want to spend responding to people or writing comments that are unkind or dismissive? So the problem with social media is that we can't really see behind the other person's eyes, their actual reality. Even those, some of those people who post real time, like it's actually happening right now in their house, or, they're dealing with a difficult parent, or anything that looks like real time TV, there is still a big persona. People are showing up a certain way on social media. So it's easy for people to lose track of who they are. And there's a component of obsessiveness that is in alignment with how we are behaving on social media. So setting your boundaries becomes even more important, because people will write comments that can sometimes be profoundly hurtful. I have experienced this myself, which is why I'm super mindful about how I interact on social media. For the most part, I interact very little, or the only way that I interact is to support you in your work, or to say a kind word. And if someone is unkind to me, I will either not engage if it's not appropriate, or I will invite them into exploring a different perspective. But for the most part, I don't really get into it on social media. I'm very clear about my boundaries on social media. And so I want to invite you to do the same, to explore creating healthier parameters for yourself. And if you're struggling with this, right? If you're struggling with creating healthier parameters, listen, this is why I'm here. This is the work that I do. I hope that this is helpful for you. And if you are having a hard time, you can always book a call with me. You can book a coaching session with me. Sometimes all it takes is one coaching session to assist you in having a sounding board and going beyond, because you can't see the forest from the trees when you're in toxic relationships. And you'll see that what I'm sharing with you, when we get on those calls, I'm very proactive, and I share some tangible, immediately applicable tools for you to shift how you are in your relationships. I give you a set of tools for you to turn around and to really start to implement that same day, how you might start to change the way you are communicating with people in your life. So, my friends, I really hope that this is helpful to you. You will be amazed to see how just tweaking a few things can really shift your perspective. And if you know anyone that is struggling with boundaries, with communication skills, with mindful communication, with how to express themselves, with being honest with themselves, if you have a sister, brother, spouse, child who needs support, please feel free to send them my way. This is my full-time job. This is what I do as a coach and as a mind-body alignment practitioner, if you're in New York City and you need support with how to process trauma and toxicity from your body, I strongly encourage to visit me if you are ever in the New York area. So my friends, I hope that this is helpful. I do have a few notes for you because I'm changing the way I am doing things, right? So I am adapting to new ways of being on YouTube, of creating more meaningful content. And so what I've decided to do is that I'm going to stop doing these lives every Monday. So next Monday will actually be the last live YouTube that I am doing in this way. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm stopping my YouTube channel. In fact, I'm growing it. So what I'm doing is I'm going to start to pre-record my Monday classes. So next week I will be live with you, and I strongly encourage you to join. I am talking about non-attachment as a tool to setting proactive boundaries with all of your relationships. We're going to dig deeper into the topic of non-attachment. What is it? How can it help you? How do you cultivate non-attachment in your life? So next week is my last live in this way. However, moving into March, starting March 5th, I'm going to have a pre-recorded session that will be dropped every Monday at 11 a.m. So if you like this time and it's convenient for you, you can continue to watch me every Monday at 11 a.m. And instead of a live interaction like this, it's going to be pre-recorded. But I will be inviting you into call to actions, even though it's pre-recorded. And instead of doing a weekly live, what I'm going to do is a monthly webinar to deepen the topic of that particular month. So for example, as of March, I think it's March 4th, will be my first pre-recorded session that I will drop on Monday at 11 a.m. And on Wednesday, March 20th at 6:30 p.m. Eastern time, 6:30 p.m. Eastern time. I'm going to see which times work best for people. So I'm starting with this one. I will be having a webinar. So that will be more of a group invitation. So if you're interested in deepening into these topics, I will be doing the webinars once per month. So March will be March 20th, 6:30 p.m. Eastern time. And the topic for March 2024 is all about breath. I will share with you what I do in my practice, my personal practice, to improve the quality of my breathing, to maintain healthy organs, healthy relationships with our organs, especially for people who deal with high anxiety, especially for people who are in very highly stressful relationships, and also women who are going through menopause and men who are going through andropause. That's the male language for menopause. I'm going to be talking about breath. We're going to go deep into breath work, how breath can assist you in recovering after exercise, how to improve your sleep patterns. And I will be taking it from a body, from a mind, and from an emotional perspective, and what can happen to increase the quality of your life, of your health, and of your happiness by practicing and knowing how to breathe effectively. I'm going to insert some anatomy, physiology in there. So you're getting a little bit of an all-inclusive mind, body, spirit, and emotional alignment in my webinars so that you actually learn the physiological functions of breath in the body and what it does for the body. So I hope that you will join me next week for my last live on the topic of non-attachment. After that, mark your calendars. We're going to start to do monthly webinars. The first one is on Wednesday, March 20th at 6:30 p.m. Eastern time. The topic for the month of March is breath. I really hope to see you then. Thank you so much for being with me today. Much love. And until next week, take care, everyone. Bye.